Chazar now, Yud Daled Amud Beis and Tetzav Amud Aleph. And we should also do Yud Daled Amud Aleph, but we're going to just do the last daf, which we did this week, which is Yud Daled Amud Beis and Tetzav Amud Aleph. So starting from the sugya of the Tami Sha'achalis HaKodesh. Right? What's Tami Sha'achalis HaKodesh? We have in the Mishnah that Tami Sha'achalis HaKodesh, Tami who eats Hekdesh gets Malchus. There's a general rule, Ein Ein Shnelim Kein Mazhirin. And over here, we don't mean Hazhar as in Hasra. We're talking about the fact that if the Torah says that if there's a punishment for something, the Torah has to not just say the punishment, but it also has to someone else say lav, loy sasa, don't do such and such. If you do, you get kares. It's not good enough just to say kikol oicho chametz nichsa. Anyone who eats chametz gets kares. It has to someone else say, even though that's cleared. So you also have to say someone that has horror, loy tzoichal chametz, for example. So the shaila over here is that Tami Shachas HaKodesh, when the Mishnah says Tami Shachas HaKodesh, which we know has a kares linked to it. How do we know? Where's that horror? That there should be a lav, and even for the kares itself, there should be malchus. You need a lav to say. So the Gemara prefaces this question by saying, "Abala migdash tamei is verstandig." There's an oynish and there's azhara. The oynish it says it's mishkan Hashem timei v'nechas. So the azhara is below tamas machneim, which means you're not allowed to go into the base of migdash while tamei. But Tami Shachas HaKodesh, taka is a oynish. Taka says in the pasuk that you get kares for eating kachim while you Tame. What's the pasuk? The pasuk is the nefesh sheteicha basam mizabach haslam Hashem v'tamasi olav v'nichasa. You eat kachim while being tame v'tamasi olav. So then there's kares. But where's that hara? There doesn't seem to be any pasuk which says clearly that tame is not allowed to eat kachim. No beferish pasuk. Don't eat kachim. Later there's a pasuk lo yoichal es kachim, but it's clear that that's talking about truma, as the Gemara later will explain from the context. It's not talking about kachim, but kachim beferish we don't have a pasuk. So therefore we have a machlekes Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan where this is learned out of. Rish Lakish says it's from the pasuk b'chol kodesh lo siga. Pasuk don't touch kachim, and it means, as will be explained later, how he got to that conclusion. But b'chol kodesh lo siga means you're not allowed to eat kachim while being tamei, even though the pasuk says lo siga means don't eat it. Rabbi Yochanan says it's Gdei Shabbat Tumasa. Taka, the Chol Kodesh Leisiga is not talking about kachim. So how do we know Taka that Tame who eats kachim gets malchus from Gdei Shabbat Tumasi? It says Tumasi by Bala Migdash Tame. It says Tumasi over there, and it says Tumasi by us. Just like over there, there's a lav which is the ferish. It says V'lo Tamas Machneim. So too over here, even though there's no beferish lav, but from the Gdei Shabbat we learn it's Ke'elu. There's a lav. Ke'elu tells us clearly not to say it. Gdei Shabbat Tumasi. Just like over there, there's an Einish Azar. So too over here. So that's the machlekes Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says we learn it out of B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. The Tami is not allowed to eat kodesh. And that's hara for Tami Shachas HaKodesh. And Rabbi Yochanan says from Gdei Shabbat Tumasa. The Gemara asks the kasha, what's the machlekes over there? We know why Rabbi Yochanan, what Rish Lakish didn't say like Rabbi Yochanan makes sense. It's Gdei Shabbat. Not everyone, either you learn Gdei Shabbat from your Rabbi or not. But why does Rabbi Yochanan not say like Rish Lakish? So the B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, the Torah tells you not to eat kachim. So the Gemara answers that Rabbi Yochanan learns B'chol Kodesh Leisiga to be referring to truma. You're not allowed to eat truma while being tamei. So then the question obviously is where does Rish Lakish? If Rish Lakish uses B'chol Kodesh Leisiga for kachim, so where does he learn truma from? So Gemara says that there's a pasuk Ishish Mizera Aaron B'Tzeru Azah B'chol Kachim Lo Yoichal. How uses the word B'chol Kachim Lo Yoichal, but because we're talking about Ishish Mizera Aaron, something which is unique to the Zera Aaron. When we say Zera Aaron, we mean both men and women equally. That the only thing which is equal to both men and women, Kohanim, is truma. It's truma. So therefore, that's where we know truma from. The question then is, what about Rabbi Yochanan? What does he use this pasuk for? So the answer is that he says there's two psukim. One, that you're not allowed to eat truma while being tamei. That's b'chol kachim le'yochal. That's the pasuk that Rish Lakish uses for truma. B'chol kodesh leisiga saying you're not allowed to touch truma, and he needs one for each one. Rish Lakish taka doesn't hold that there's taka no lav in touching truma. You're not allowed to for other reasons, but it's taka no lav. The taka wouldn't be malchus for touching truma while being tamei. Okay, now the Gemara asks a number of kashas on how we can say that Rish Lakish uses B'chol Kodesh Leisiga for not eating kachim while being tamei. So question number one is that we see there's a itmar where Rish Lakish says that tamei who touches kachim gets malchus because of the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. Rabbi Yochanan says no, it's talking about truma, like the shitasi, like we said earlier. Rish Lakish says that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga teaches me that Tommy is not allowed to touch kachim, which contradicts what we said earlier that Rish Lakish is saying b'chol kodesh leisig is that you're not allowed to eat kachim. So the Gemara answers that Taka we learn both from it. With the afkirach mana b'lashon negif, and the fact that pasuk says loisiga teaches me that you're not allowed to touch kachim. But since it's juxtaposed, since it's besmichas to belamigdash leisavei, we learn that the b'chol kodesh leisiga has to be dummy to belamigdash, has to be similar. Just like belamigdash leisavei, a Tommy person who comes to the base of Mikdash gets kares. So too, the lav of the lav of b'chol kodesh leisiga must be referring to a certain contact with kodshim that you're having, which is punishable by kares, and that can only be eating, because that's where we find kares. So Bahamas we learn both. The Kodesh Leisika must be talking about eating because it's next to Velamigdash Leisava, but with the Afkirach Mana B'Lashon Negi, we learn Negi as well. So we tackle them both according to Rish Lakish. So that is the answer to that kasha. Kasha was that the Churba Kodesh Leisika is talking about touching kachim, not eating. So we answer taka both. Lashon Negia, but from the fact that it's next to Velamigdash Tameh, Velamigdash Leisavi is in the same pasuk, so that's how we learn that it's talking about achila as well. So now the Gemara asks another kasha. The Gemara's kasha is that there's a machlekes in Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan whether the iser, the lav, the malchus for Tomei Sha'achal Es HaKodesh, which which Rabbi Yochanan learns from Tomase. Rish Lakish learns from Kodesh Leisiga. So there's a machlekes whether the malchus, which the Mishnah says, is only applies to la'achaz rikas adam or also lifnei rikas adam. What's the difference la'achaz rikas adam, lifnei rikas adam? La'achaz rikas adam, that's when the carbon has been miratza. That's when the carbon is a good carbon. That's when the koyanim tahirim are allowed to eat it, or the tar is allowed to eat the carbon. Lifnei rikas, no one's allowed to eat the carbon. So the question is, what happens if a tame eats kachim lifnei rikas adam? Is he also gets malchus or not? So we say that Rish Lakish learns out of the pasuk b'chol kodesh leisiga that even if neizrikas adam it also applies. Rabbi Yochanan says ein eloika. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say ein eloika? Rabbi Yochanan says ein eloika because it says in pasuk tumasi. The whole mock in the first place they get markers from Gzei Shabbat tumasi, and that's learned from Abala Mikdash Tami where there's kari. So also must be talking about and Tumasi is talking about Achazrika. So that's the Gemara's kasha. So you just have to touch us a little bit over here. Why can't we be talking about both the Nezrika and the Achazrika? So the Mefarshim explain in other places, in other Masechtas, I think it's a Rashi in Zvachim, that Vaita, because it's the Kodesh Leisiga ve'el Amigdash Leisava, it has to be dumya to Amigdash Leisava where there's a kares. So therefore the person must be talking about Achazrika. The person must be talking about la'achaz rika as well. How do we know lifnei zrika? So the Gemara answers that how do I know lifnei zrika is damim from the bechol kodesh. In other words, kodesh says kodesh leisiga. The bechol kodesh includes all types of kachim, even lifnei zrika. But that's in the pasuk is taka talking about la'achaz rika as well as lifnei zrika. And then the Gemara finally said there's taka brais, which goes like Rish Lakish, the bechol kodesh leisiga is coming to tell me you're not allowed to eat kachim while being tamei. The Gemara asks how do you know? Maybe it's talking about not touching kachim. So Itaka says the same thing we said earlier, but the Brisa touches the oyster. Since this connects to Amigdash Leisave, so we're comparing Kodesh to Migdash. Just like by Migdash, there's an issue, there's a kares and Netilas Neshama, there's a oynish of Netilas Neshama, of kares. So too we know that the passage of Kodesh Leisiga also must be talking about a situation where there's kares. For touching kachim, there's no kares. So must be the Kodesh Leisiga isn't just talking about touching kachim while being tummy, but also not eating kachim while tummy. So that's the first Amud, which we learned together on Monday, and now we're going to do a review of the Amud that we did today. The second Amud of this week, which is Daftes Vav Amud Aleph. So what goes on over here? Rabbi Barbachan and Rabbi Yochanan said a din. What's the din? When we say lava nitik lasei doesn't get malchus according to that shitta, it's only if it's literally a lava nitik lasei, meaning that the asay comes, it can only be done after the lav. Don't steal. If you do, the mitzvah asay. Don't do noisar. Don't leave the carbon until the morning. If you do, burn it. So asay can only be performed, can only be done after you transgress the lav, and it fixes the lav. But if the asay is an asay which is connected to the lav, but it could be done even before, the asay could be mekoyim even before you've been over the loisasa, then that's not called a lav and asay, even though it's connected to an asay. It's right. But since it's not the asay, the asay is not interlinked with the lav in such a way that you only can mekayim asay after being over the lav, so therefore you get malchus. That's what Rabbi Bachana said in Rabbi Yochanan. When people heard this, Rabbi Yochanan, they asked Rabbi Yochanan, did you really say this? Rabbi Yochanan said, no, I didn't say it. Rashi explains it means he was chayzer. He retracted. The question is, why did he retract? And Rabbi actually asked the kasha that l'chura it's mefurish a mishnah that you have a lav akadma. Our mishnah in Elin Aloikim gives an example of a lav shekadma essay, and you get Malkus. What's the example? The example is a case of habal mikdash tamei. Habal mikdash tamei. There's a lav. What's the lav? The lav is the loyitamis machneim. There's also assay b'shalchum min machne. You have to be sent out, and that assay could be done even before. If a person finds himself tamei, he hasn't been over the lav by going in. We say you have to leave. So that assay is kadmei the lav. That assay is both before the lav and after the lav. And nevertheless, and we see that there's Malkus taka. So why was Rabbi Yochanan chayzer? Not only why was Rabbi Yochanan, how could he be chayzer? The Mishnah Taka says otherwise. So the Rishonim address that kasha, how Rabbi Yochanan could be chayzer despite the Mishnah. We'll leave that for the moment. If you're interested, you can look in the Ritva and other places. But why Taka was he chayzer? What bothered him? What made him be chayzer at all? So the Gemara explains that he had a kasha from Oinus. What's pshat? He had a kasha from Oinus. The Brayso says, the pasuk says that if you ma'anas a woman, there's a mitzvah saseh v'lo yisir le'isha. You have to marry the woman if she's interested. And then the pasuk says lo yuchel shal kol yom. You're not allowed to divorce him. What happens if you did divorce him? So then you've got mitzvah lo yisir le'isha. But the lo yisir le'isha can be done even before the lo yuchel, even before the lav of divorcing them, right? You have to get married anyway. It's a lav shekad maseh, and nevertheless, the Brayso says that the oinus shegirish, if he's a yid who could remarry her and be Makai in the midst of lo yisir le'isha, doesn't get Malkus for divorcing the woman. Mashenkin a Klein does get divorced because there's no way of fixing up the lav, because he's not allowed to marry her because she's a grusha. A Klein's not allowed to marry a grusha. At the very least, what do we see from this Brayso? That a Yisroel who's Megarish doesn't get Malkus despite being over the lav lo yuchel shalfu kol yom. Why is he not getting Malkus? Must be because there's an assay connected to it. But it's a lav shekadma assay. So that's taka why Rabbi Yochanan was chayzer. We see that lav shekadma assay gets Malkus. The Brayso says that the ma'anas, someone who's ma'anas somebody, he's taka over lo yuchel shalfu, but since he can fix it up with lo yisir le'isha, even though lo yisir le'isha is also before the lav, nevertheless, that's considered, it falls into the category, it's you don't get Malkus for it. So that's why he was chayzer. How are we going to answer those who, like Rabbi Shittu, who says that Rabbi Yochanan's original din is a good din, that the Lav Shekad Maseh does get Malkus, the Chur by the Anis we see otherwise. So all that suggests over here 4 different variations, 4 different terutzim of how this is the case. In other words, why Oinus is not a classical Lav Shekad Maseh. And the Kuda is that in all 4 terutzim, what he's basically saying is, and even in the final teretz of Rabbi, which is the 5th answer, which is the final answer, the kud of all the answers is that ma'anas is not a lav shekad maseh. Taka, there's an assay before the lav, but there's also an assay after the lav. And therefore, since there's also an assay after, a separate assay, not that same assay which can be done before the lav, a separate assay after the lav, so therefore it's a lav anitil assay and you get malchus. But were it to be a regular lav shekad maseh, where there's only one assay and that assay could be done both before and after the lav, then taka you get malchus. The reason why ma'anas doesn't get malchus is because it's a lav anitil assay. Why is that lav anitil assay? Lo yisir le'isha could be done earlier. So 4 different terutzim all that suggest. Number 1 is that there's no need to say lo yisir le'isha by oinus at all. To say that an oinus needs to get married, you don't need the pasuk lo yisir le'isha. Why you don't need the pasuk? Because you can learn out of Moitzi Shemra. Moitzi Shemra, the Kabbalah, Moitzi Shemra was loy asa ma'isa, and nevertheless, despite loy asa ma'isa, we see that he has a knas. He needs to get married. So Kabbalah, Ma'anis has to also get married. So why do you take the pasuk lo yisir le'isha? Says the Gemara, in fun of it. There's no reason to lo yisir le'isha. There's no need to be said to tell the person who was ma'anis, the woman, to go get married to, because that could be learned out of Moitzi Shemra. It must be that he's coming to tell me a new assay. That there's a unique assay that if he divorces her, he's got a new assay to go remarry her, and it becomes a lav anitik assay because there's a new lo yisir le'isha. It can't be talking about before; it can only be talking about after, because the chiyuv to marry before can be learned out of Kavachayim from Moitzi Shemra, and that's what the Gemara suggests. All it suggests, try number 1. Gemara asks on that. It's not a good Kavachayim. You can't say oinus can be learned out of Moitzi Shemra because oinus Moitzi Shemra has a chumrah. Which besides having the color that ain't by mice has a chumrah of loikom mishalim, and therefore you can't learn oinus out of Moitzi Shemra, and therefore we're back to our original problem, which is that the lo yisir le'isha is needed for oinus, and if lo yisir le'isha is needed for oinus, and it's a lav shekad maseh, and not just a lav anitik asay. So therefore it should get malchus. Why does the Brayso say other ones? So therefore all the number 2, all the teretz number 2 says a different pshat. What's the pshat he says over the taki need lo yisir le'isha by oinus for before the lav is being transgressed. But the pasuk of lo yisir le'isha by Moitzi Shemra is not needed. Why is the pasuk lo yisir le'isha? So what? First of all, what's going on. She says Loisila Isha by Moiti Shamra is not needed. Why is Loisila Isha by Moiti Shamra not needed? The reason why Loisila Isha by Moiti Shamra is not needed is because we can learn Moiti Shamra from Oinus. Malo Oinus, Shekain Ein Eloikum Mishalem. It's got a color that you don't get the double punishment, and nevertheless there's a knasti he has to marry her. He says Loisila Isha by Oinus. So by Moiti Shamra for sure. So therefore comes out that the pasuk Loisila Isha by Moiti Shamra isn't needed for Moiti Shamra. And if the pasuk of Loisila Isha is not needed for Moiti Shamra, so then let's say that the pasuk of Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra should be used for Oinus, but not for Oinus for before getting married, because Oinus has its own pasuk of Loisila Isha. Alamai, that Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra is used to tell me that a ma'anas who marries the person who's ma'anas, then divorces her, has a separate mitzvah of Loisila Isha, the Loisila Isha which is said by Moiti Shamra, which is extra, is used for ma'anas and teaches me that it's a lav and it's laseh and there's no mal. That is what the Gemara all it suggests in try number 2, and the Gemara answers, "What do you mean? You can't say that oinus is learnt out of that you can learn oinus out of Moiti Shamra. That you can learn Moiti Shamra from oinus. You can't say that you learn Moiti Shamra from oinus. Mala oinus can asa ma'isa. Oinus has a chumrah that there's a ma'isa. Moiti Shamra lo yasa ma'isa, and therefore maybe only oinus has Loisila Isha, not Moiti Shamra, and therefore you need a Loisila Isha for Moiti Shamra. So back to square one, basically, that we only have the only pasuk we have by Oinus for Loisila Isha is the pasuk which can be done even before the lav, and it's a lav shekad masay. And if so, why are you not getting Makkos? Why does the bride say not get Makkos? Says Ola in variation number 3 of why Oinus and Ma'anis is a lav and it's lasay. Right with the same general gang as the step before, which is that the Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra is superfluous. Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra is extra. Why is the Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra extra? Because it's not needed, but not because it could be learned out of Oinus. We already said that you can't. No, there's no Kavachayim of it. So why tak is Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra extra? Says the Loisila Isha tells me you have to go get married. Moiti Shamra is already married to his wife. It's not like a Ma'anis where he wasn't married. He was Ma'anis, a Basula, a girl who had no shaykhs to him. Here he made up a story. He's Moiti Shamra by his own wife. If he was Moiti Shamra about his own wife, then the pasuk of Loisila Isha doesn't make sense. Loisila Isha, go get married to her. You're already married. Elamai, the pasuk's extra. If the pasuk's extra, then use it for oinus. And you can't use it for oinus for before because it's his own pasuk, Loisila Isha. So use it for oinus after, and it makes ma'anis alav and nitilase. That is variation number 3, which the Gemara slugs up by saying, what do you mean? Even if the pasuk's not needed for Moiti Shamra lefanov, because he's already married, but you need the pasuk of Loisila Isha and Moiti Shamra to tell me that if he divorces a mitzvah say to divorce her and to say that it's a lav and nitilase and he shouldn't get Makkos. The Gemara says, enochanam, you're right. The taka, the Loisila Isha Moiti Shamra is for Moiti Shamra of la'akrav, and it's a lav and nitilase. So how taka can you learn oinus? So all the number 4, basically, so the variation number 4 says that we learn oinus out of Moiti Shamra. In other words, just like by Moiti Shamra, the Loisila Isha isn't needed for before, and we use it for after to tell me to lav and nitilase. So too by oinus, even though it's a lav shekad ma'aseh, there shouldn't be Makkos because we learn it out of Moiti Shamra. So the Gemara says, so you can't do that because whether you're learning from a Kavachayim or Binyan Av, Moiti Shamra has a certain color that's lo yasamaisa. So maybe that's why it's considered it doesn't get Makkos. We don't learn out oinus, which yasamaisa, that there's also no Makkos. Finally, what does Rabbi say? Rabbi says this is the 5th answer why. And the final answer, which we stick with, why Ma'anas is not considered a lav shekad maseh, and why it's considered lav anitik laseh, is not because of a Loisila Isha. The cost of Loisila Isha is taka naseh, which is koydem the lav, and doesn't make the lav into lav anitik laseh. And you taka would get Makkos were only for the pasuk of Loisila Isha. But the vart over here is that when the pasuk says lo yuchel l'shalcha kol yamav, it could have said lo yuchel l'shalcha. The extra words kol yamav are extra. The word kol yamav tells me lo yuchel l'shalcha, you're not allowed to divorce her in a way that she stays divorced kol yamav, which means to say that included in the lav lo yuchel l'shalcha, don't divorce her, and if you do divorce her, don't keep it that way. You need to remarry her. So there's I say it's almost as if the Torah is telling you go remarry her and fix up the lav, and therefore it's considered a lav anitilase. And we say that's taka what Rabbi Yochanan says, and so on. So now just one last piece before we finish, which is back to the original thing. We meyasha why lav shekad ma'aseh is loikin and why oinus doesn't pose a problem to that cloud, because oinus is a lav anitilase. The question is why taka lav shekad ma'aseh gets Makkos. The whole reason why lav anitik laseh doesn't get Makkos is because it's tumi the lav the chasima. In other words, in order to get Makkos, it has to be similar to the loisachsam, which is said in the parish of the Makkos. And just like loisachsam is a lav ain't anitik laseh, so too only lav which are not connected to aseh. The question then, the question we have now is that lav shekad maseh is also not doing it to lav the chasima. So the Gemara answers that what do you mean? Just because there's an extra assay, a separate assay which isn't connected to lav, that shall make it worse. Still doing it to loisachsam. It's just that there's another assay. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, in lav and nitilase, you can ask the same thing. just because the Torah says an extra assay makes it worse. The Gemara says no. There's a fundamental difference between lav and nitik lasei and lav shekod masei. Lav and nitik lasei, the assay is fixing up the lav. So because the assay is fixing up the lav, it weakens the lav, that the lav isn't going to loisachsim. So the loisachsim is don't do something, and that's it. If you do it, you messed up. There's no way of fixing it. But lav shenitik lasei, the Torah is telling you don't do something, and if you do, there's a way of fixing it up. So the lav is not going to the mashenkin. Lav shekod masei is the assay is totally independent of the lav, and therefore it is dumya to lav the chasim.